Hey, I'm Frank, and in this video I'm going to show you how I made my original character in Unreal Engine 5. Let's get into it.
So starting off, we're going to go into PureRef, gathering all the references like I usually like to do. I kind of like to break it up into different things like clothing, maybe some face paint. Clothing was a big one in this one, so I really wanted to get a good few references in there for that. And then over there in the top right is the original photo bashed one that I've put together, which you can obviously tell from the end result. So this is going back through the face scans, the scan workflow that I did. I've got another video that you can check it out here if you want to see exactly how I've done that, but I've just breezed through here how we use ZWrap and how we project scan textures onto our model. The basic premise is having a scanned data model off somewhere like 3D Scan Store or Texture XYZ, and then projecting it onto your base mesh of the character that you've got. So it's the process of placing the points on model A that correspond with model B, and then running the ZWrap tool to then project your model onto theirs, and then using theirs as the new base mesh, which was our starting point for this character. So starting off with the first pieces of armor, I basically used the base mesh for all of the pieces of armor as a good starting point. So all the polygroups that were there, I've just kind of extracted it and then used the modeler to start deleting pieces, moving them around, starting getting some edge flow the way that I wanted it to be. But then also, using Dynamesh and being kind of rough and loose as far as blocking out things like the headdress, just trying to get some sizes and shapes, even the hair, like it's pretty rudimentary pieces. It's just to get a pretty good idea of where we want to be going with this, make sure we get the scale right, and more or less just getting things onto the model as soon as you can. So here you can see again, just pinching the base mesh, duplicating it, and then having that as a separate subtool, and then inflating it on top, and then just redrawing that topology. That was a pretty common thing through all of the armor pieces that I was doing here, was the extract and then redrawing the topology for where I wanted the edge loops to be going. But as you can see here, just exactly the same thing. Pinching those polygroups, duplicating, extracting, inflating them, and then pushing and pulling them around to roughly get the shapes I was after. This is pretty much the same process in theory as using Dynamesh and starting to block it out. I found that because I knew the shape of the character and the way that I wanted it to look, in this case, using the existing base mesh would work well. Doesn't always work for every case, but in this one it did. Going on with a few more tweaks, just moving those base meshes around, and then now we're going to mask out some sections and then slightly pose the character here. So we're still going to be using symmetry for now and just moving it into more of a relaxed pose, only because I find it's a little bit easier when you're doing things like the armor and clothing parts that are going to be fitting around it, is that you're going to want somewhat of the position that you're going to want the character in. More of the same thing as before, masking out the pinching some of the polygroups that we're using off the base mesh, and then just redrawing that topology to be our new mesh, in this case for the boots. So moving on to the gauntlets, again, just extracting a polygroup from the original base mesh, giving it a bit of thickness and redrawing some of that topology. I like to apply materials inside of ZBrush, just sometimes it helps with the modeling. As you can see there, I've applied that metal onto the gauntlets, and then extracting that other part of the skirt from the base mesh that we've actually extracted from the original base mesh. And then moving on to the gauntlets, doing a little bit more Z-modeler work, just blocking out some of the extra details that we need there. Z-modeler is probably your best tool to be using in this stage if you're going to be doing this method of working with an extremely low poly mesh. See things like this, you can be extruding those sections in so easily with not a lot of cost to the amount of polygons that we're using, and it's a lot easier to manipulate as well. So I do find that this is probably one of the better methods. for blocking out instead of using Dynamesh. Obviously it's project dependent, but I do find if you have a really nice base mesh and you have a really clear description of what your concept is, I do like to use work at extremely low poly for as long as I can before I move up into the high res details. So moving on to the garment section in Marvelous Designer, what we want to be doing is importing our avatar, which is our body model, which you would import as an avatar, and then our geometry that we're going to be using is imported as a garment. So what we did in ZBrush was just unwrap this and cut it along the edges that we wanted to have it as if you would any UV model. And then the section here in Marvelous is stitching those edges together. I don't want to go too far into Marvelous Designer in this, as it's really just a stepping stone to get a good starting point for the cloth. All we're doing there is having an avatar model and then running a gravity simulator over the meshes that we already existingly have, just to get a really good starting point for our garments. And then all I do is bring it back into ZBrush, smooth it, and then shuffle it around. It's really, again, it's just to get a really good starting point instead of having to sculpt all those details by hand. Onto the skirt section, exactly the same process, just cutting it along that edge there, unwrapping it, and then stitching it inside of Marvelous. Running the gravity simulator, and then re-importing that back into ZBrush to refine, just to get those little wrinkles there, the little wrinkles and the natural hang that you would have on a piece of material like that. There's ways that you could do that inside of ZBrush. I do find that Marvelous is pretty easy for this, especially if you're using a single plane mesh like this. Then you can just run a zero mesh, divide, and then smooth it, and it gives you a really good, clean piece of topology to work with moving forward. Yeah, as you can see, there's a couple of little difficult sections there, which are easily fixed when it is low poly. So when you do run a little bit of zero mesh on it, you can start to move those pieces around. The pants I found were probably one of the biggest successes in the Marvelous Designer section of this project, only because you can see how simple the original mesh is that I made, and then just sewed the two edges, and then running that simulator almost gave me the perfect result for what I was after in these pants, which if you were to hand sculpt this section in ZBrush, it either would have taken you 5 times as long or wouldn't have looked anywhere near as good. So I was really happy with the way those pants came out. Just a little bit more refining on the scarf. As you can see, it's really starting to take shape. And then we move on to the boots, where this was a bit of a difficult one that I wanted to be able to make all the boots you can see in the reference there under one mesh. So the way that I did that was I broke it up into sections of different poly groups, kept the resolution really, really low, and tried to be really clever with poly grouping and then insetting and having different seam lines and redrawing the topology so that it was clean, so that I could run operations like this where I could extrude in and then have nice topology moving forward just as one single mesh. Is sort of using the same type of theory, using low resolution. I mean, in all the projects that I work on, in all the videos, if you've seen, I find that this is a really good way of working, as everything's easily maneuverable, everything's easy to add resolution to when you're adding subdivisions in, and making big changes are really, really easy when you've got such low resolution topology. So I highly recommend starting at the lowest resolution that you can comfortably work at, and then just getting those big shapes, because once you do go to a higher resolution, it is going to be a lot more difficult to add in those big changes. So jumping back down to the boots, using the insert mesh brushes and the curve strap snap, I'm adding in the straps and the buckles. This was a little bit different than the other portions of the project, as I wanted to use the mesh that I'd created, the effort and time that I'd put into keeping that good topology, that low res topology. I actually wanted to use that as my render mesh. So when I drop down to subdivision 1, I can actually export that mesh and use that as my in-game mesh. The beauty of this is I can still jump up to 6, as you can see there, subdivision 6, and sculpt in all this high-res detail. But when it comes to actually exporting my render mesh, I'll jump back down to subdivision 1 and use that as my in-game mesh. I was okay with using this method for a piece like the boots. I probably wouldn't have done this for something that needed a little bit more high-res detail and a little bit more effort. But for something like the boots, I think this was the perfect workflow because it did save me from needing to rebuild that render mesh at the end. So moving on to the sword, I actually wasn't sure if I was going to be doing this as part of the project. I did see it as somewhat of a break from the big project because it didn't look like I'd done much modeling up until this point, but it was a good excuse to take a step back and say, hey, let's jump onto something else, something that's easy and smaller and manageable. Something that I do find is a good trick when you do get a little bit burnt out from the bigger project itself, or it's becoming, you feel like you're spinning the wheels or you're not really getting somewhere with it. I do find that jumping out and saying, hey, look, I'm going to do something from start to finish is a good way to get that creativity going again in a positive way. I mean, this was not a huge part of the end presentation, but I was very happy with the fact that I did do it because I was considering not doing it, and I feel like it was a good addition in the final presentation, and it didn't take me that long. As you can see, it's just a bunch of Z modeling, smoothing and pinching along that edge. A couple hours and you've got yourself a really good prop that probably made that presentation a lot better, as well with posing the hand, having the hand actually grabbing something gave a little bit more personality to the final presentation, I think. So yeah, just a couple little things to think of when you're building out your characters and what more you can be doing to add to it to really plus it at the end at that presentation, because when you're in the middle of it, all you're really thinking of is finishing, but you're going to thank yourself at the end of it when you've got this really awesome addition to it that you thought, oh, I wish I went back and did that before. Like I said, even if you wanted to use it as somewhat of a hiatus from the main project, just to give you a bit of a break, it's a good way to channel your energy into another really cool asset for the end result. A modeling technique I usually use a lot of, but I hadn't really until this section, was extracting from the mesh, because all the meshes up until this point were basically built off the base mesh, which already had great topology. This one was basically just a Dynamesh blob that I extracted, and then that doesn't really give you the best topology, so that just run a Z-remesh over it. Kind of got it to the same point as all the rest of them, which is the same theory that I just keep trying to instill, is that you really want to be working with the lowest res that you possibly can. Subdivisions will come later. It's easy to work when the mesh is low. So moving on to the nose chain. So as you can see there, I made an insert mesh brush from 2 tubes and then use that along a curve strap to make the chain for the nose chain. I actually loved this part of the project because it was really, I didn't know how to approach it. I've seen people do meshes like this before and not really sure how they achieved it, so it was kind of fun. And then a sort of a similar process to make this tube-like thing here. I just had a bunch of cylinders and then used that curve and then merged it as a Dynamesh. So for this next section, I'll just kind of explain what I'm doing here. So I've made a folder up the top as my low poly mesh. So what I'm doing here is I'm going through and I'm merging everything that I want to be under one texture set as the lowest res that I possibly have inside of ZBrush. So there are certain things there that weren't. So as you can see, the pants, very high. So what I want to be doing is redrawing that topology. So in the game res engine that we're going to be using, everything needs to be somewhat of the same resolution or a very low resolution to be put into the game engine. So these pants, because they're run through Marvelous, even the amount of Z-remesh or whatever I did inside of ZBrush, it's probably not going to be the best topology. So what the process is now is going through and redrawing over the render mesh in Maya, and then this will be our new game mesh, which will then bake the details from Marvelous onto this new mesh. So ideally, every mesh in your game ready render mesh will have some level of retopology like this on it, but there are ways around it, like what we spoke about before, with the boots not being like a super important part of this project, and somewhere that I saw that we could, you know, maybe take somewhat of a shortcut, and actually just using that subdivision 1 as the render mesh. That probably is not going to fly with pants like this, where they have, you know, crazy detailed folds and intricate topology flow. I really wanted to get this right, in case I ever did want to animate this or have somewhat of it moving. It's going to need a proper topology flow, as you can see here, same way that you would with arms and legs. So this was probably one of the longer sections of the project, was going through and working out the retopology for this mesh. But I think it's worth it because you can see by the end of this, when I subdivide it, you can see it was a really good outcome and really worth the effort, because this was the actual render mesh that we used in the final render. And just as a bit of a sanity check, just do a poly smooth on it there just to see how it looks subdivided, and it looks great. So the next step after retopologizing is UVing. So every single mesh that is going to be going into Unreal needs to have UVs, obviously. So having our topology and dictating where our edge flow is inside of Maya is going to make UVing super easy. It's a couple of little clicks on our edge loops, as you can see there. We cut along those lines and then unfold. So we want to be going through and doing this for every single texture set that we're going to be using on our low res mesh. So in this case, the pants were one texture set. So this is all we need to worry about for now. The thing that I do like to make sure when UVing, I think a lot of people get scared, or they get, you know, stagnant when it comes to UVing and whether what's the right way or wrong way to do it. At the end of the day, just cut it, unfold it, get it all packed. The one thing that I would stress is to keep them uniform. So when you can see me packing them there, all of these pieces of the mesh have the same textile density. So that means when you're putting a material on, it looks the same scale around the whole thing, which is just a small little important thing that I do like to remember. Similar process here with the hood, just cutting along those edges. I actually did use the mesh inside of ZBrush for this, because this was going to be such a high, close to the camera important section. So I know this is kind of contradicting what I was saying before, but this mesh looked so good. I didn't really want to go any lower resolution for the hood and the scarf, and it wasn't too expensive, so I thought I'd just keep it the way that it is. If I did want to go through and retopologize it, I could, but I think it was fine the way it is, considering everything else on the model was quite low. So what I'm doing here is going through and adding vertex color. So what adding vertex color does is it helps us, it gives us a information to bake our ID map when we go into Substance Painter. So what that means is when we have a low poly mesh that has multiple subtools inside it, like the armor you could see there that had all those belt buckles and stuff, or the boots that have all the buckles and straps, we can just have one mesh and then use this ID map mask to drive masks inside a Substance Painter on the one mesh. So basically, all you really need to know for now is to fill vertex color into all the different pieces that you would like to have as a separate mask. We can go into Substance Painter with a single mesh and still be able to quickly mask out different sections. Like you can see that the bottom part of the boot or the larger part, and have different materials on there. So just moving through to the other pieces, UVing, smoothing out, unfolding. The armor was, again, you can see this was a subdivision 1 level from ZBrush, and I couldn't have built a better low res render mesh have done it better in Maya. So there are certain cases you can see here where it's better to have worked in low res and then subdivided up, because it saves you needing to build a render mesh. So building off that original great base mesh does have its perks and works for some cases. So definitely assess if, when you're working on your project, whether or not it's worth doing that instead of having to redo a mesh inside of Maya. So this is another choice here that I've made, is putting those gauntlets onto the same UV texture set as the armor. So we've got multiple pieces here that are going to be under the one texture set. I think it's a really good move to, you know, assess your model and see which pieces don't need full texture sets and which ones that you can pack together with other ones under the same sets. So jumping over into Substance Painter, we're going to bring our low res mesh that we've either made or used subdivision ones, and all UV'd. So every single mesh that we have here has a UV set and a material applied to it as our texture sets. As you can see there, see those purple lines? If you do have purple lines on any of the meshes that when you bring into the new Substance Painter, that just means that the edges need to be smooth. So if you soften the edge in Maya, that'll get rid of those. So what we're doing here is just going to load in our high-res meshes from Zbrush that correspond to the texture sets that we have inside of Substance Painter, and then we're just going to run a bake. I actually have a baking video here if you want to go more in depth with baking, but for this I'm just going to breeze through it. But yeah, if you wanted to have a look into more how to do intricate baking and ways to troubleshoot if you're having issues with it, go check out that video. This is the part where the vertex color comes in there. See that ID map? We've just dropped down to vertex color, and we've lost our high-res mesh because we don't want to be using our high-res mesh for the ID maps, because our vertex color is actually on our low poly. So we want to bake our ID map from our low poly, which all that vertex color. So what that does is it says, okay, I'm going to make a map based off all that information that's in here that you've placed in Maya, and now we have all of those to use as our masks. So beginning the texturing process, I actually went onto Substance Source, the 3D asset site that comes with Substance when you have the account, and just went through a lot of the, you know, ornamental detail, like weird patterns and stuff like that I thought would fit really well with this character. Nothing was sort of out of the box exactly what I wanted. So I did actually merge multiple different textures together using things like masking and layering different types of materials. It also gave me greater creative control over how I wanted the character to look from my original design, the original photo bashed concept. It would have been pretty lucky if I had just found something straight out of the box like that. I think that's very rare, and also doesn't really give a lot of character to the character. So I think some level of customization like this is always good, just to give it somewhat of a unique flair. Otherwise it's just going to look, you know, like you've just bought something and thrown it in there. So I would always, almost always recommend going through and giving it some level of uniqueness. So during this process, I actually do find myself surprising myself with the design. I think this is a really good way to just get in on the tools and say, let's see what we can make here. Substance is really great for that because it's so easy to use, and it's so easy to iterate and see different variations. This wasn't really the path that I was going to go down, and I probably wouldn't have even figured it out unless I started throwing materials into the scene and just started masking things out. Obviously it looks a bit jank there, but when I did refine it, it ended up being, I was actually really happy with the result. But yeah, as you can see, like it's pretty hack job where I've just masked out around that gold trim. But when you've got all those masks in there, you can be using all the hide information again further that creative control and that creative iteration that you want to be doing inside a Substance Painter if you're making an original material. So this is another product of me just jumping in and having a go with something and seeing how it looks. I thought a lot of the issue with characters and character texturing is that you texture in the way that is easiest for you to texture, based on the model, based on the UVs. What I wanted to do is add something that almost took away the UVing seams. I know that sounds a little bit difficult to understand, but I thought putting a gold trim around that front really sold the fact that this was a piece of material and this was the edge of the material. Other than you can see where the blue section is, it kind of just looked like it was a material that was thrown onto an object. This trim for me was like a really big selling point, as far as this is the edge of a larger piece of fabric that is wrapped around a head. I just think little details like that really helped with the selling of the face section of this character, as it's obviously such a big part of the character, of any character, is its face. But just getting this right and getting it looking believable, I think was really important, and I was pretty happy with the way that it turned out. So just adding in some more texture variation there, and as you can see, continuing that trim down the side of the hood. This was just another product of a bit of creative exploration inside of Substance. I don't usually like to defer too far from, if I have an idea, if I have something in any type of professional work, but considering that this is a personal project, I do enjoy the process of just being able to say, hey, I'm just going to wing this and I'm going to change it a little bit. There was a few things like that in this project that I did, because that's kind of what it's about, right? Like this is supposed to be fun. Like this was supposed to be a bit of a fun project, to test my skills and to test, just to try out some new things. So I was actually pretty happy with the way that scarf and the hood turned out. So moving on to the armor pieces. So this was actually one of the materials that I think in the texturing process that stayed pretty true to the concept. So the concept design was like a matte rusty type metal, that I knew from the very initial photo bashing of the concept. I thought that is a piece that I'm definitely going to want to get right, because I feel like it was a very unique looking piece that gave a lot of breakup, because the rest of the character is basically fabrics and leathers. I felt like this like rusty metal with a bit of fall off to it really was the difference in the rest of the materials. So you can see here what I'm doing is I'm looking for somewhat of a mask that I can be using to break up the sheen of the reflectivity and then the roughness. So a lot of the best materials that I find, they have real world damage. So the way that I see that is, things that are lower to the ground, things that have a lot of moving pieces around it, wouldn't have a lot of grime. So around here, around where that dirt would collect, would be around that waistband. So I've used that dirt gradient there just as a way to break up the roughness. And as you can see, lining that up to where my reference was, it gives a pretty good result. Another good little trick here is adding in the ambient occlusion pass to areas that you want to have a little bit of darker. So I'm adding it to the body here. You can just see I've added a fill layer, dropped it on the base color, and then blended it over the top, and it just darkens under basically in the darker areas that you would have it. So, and you can control that with the opacity slider. So moving on to the pants, another material that I grabbed off the 3D Substance asset library. I really wanted this to look like a worn linen, old dusty sort of worn linen for the pants, staying pretty true to the reference. and it just fleshing in some of that ornamental detail on the metal here. I don't think it really changed that much from the one of the original references that I had. It was more or less just some shapes around there. I was a little bit more precious with things like the belt buckle and things around the face area that I wanted to have true to the native area of where this character is from. So really similar to the body plate armor, the breakup that I wanted to put on to the pretty much every item of clothing on this character, I wanted to make it the same way that it would be broken up in real life. A lot of the parts that are closer to the ground be a lot more worn and then gradually work their way up. That dirt gradient texture for the alpha that I used on the body plate, I use that again here on the pants. It's a really good way of just breaking it up as far as a linear, like bottom to top type, and then also breaking it up with some curvature for that light and dark breakup on the pants as well. Just areas that would be catching sun and areas that would be catching, the natural elements of the world that should be in. Yeah, so moving on to the scarf section, I actually just left this before because I wasn't sure if I was going to be using it the same as the headdress, but having it blank didn't really make sense. So I kind of wanted to make it look like it was all one piece that it just kind of draped around the neck and then around the head. So I wanted to use the exact same material that I used for the hood. As you can see there, that I used the ID mask to pinch it, and then just use the exact same tools that I used with layering and masking, and then going through pretty much the same process that I did with the hood to get those details in manually by hand, as there wasn't really a way to plug and play. So I sort of just needed to chip away at it. So moving back to the skin, before when I used the ambient occlusion pass as a texture detail on the skin, you can actually use it as a mask as well. So what I've done is I wanted to break up the skin from the top layer of skin to the underside. So in reality, there is a lot more differentiation in the top layer of the skin to the underarm, because the direct face of the skin that's facing the sun obviously is going to have a different hue to it than the underside, which doesn't get a lot of sun damage and a lot of sun exposure. So all I wanted to do is use that ambient occlusion mask to get some sort of breakup between the underside and the top side of the skin, which gives just enough breakup for it to look a little bit more natural. Moving on to the little bag that she's got there on her belt. Something I really wanted to keep an eye out for, something that I did on my Kratos project, was on a character like this that has a lot of different types of the same material, I didn't want to make it look too matchy-matchy. So things like leathers and metals and fabrics, I really wanted to push a level of difference between each one. Whether that be through a diffuse change or a specular change, I really wanted to treat each piece like it was its own individual thing with its own individual attributes. I also put a little bit of height information on the edges of this bag just to make it look like it was a little bit extra of a fold underneath there, and then later in the piece I actually ended up putting some stitches along that line as well. And then moving on to these other little pieces here, I grabbed a bone texture with a little bit of extra detail from the 3D Assets Substance store, and then just dialed it all the way back. As these weren't going to be the biggest piece, I just wanted to make sure that they did have a little bit of extra love and they weren't just a flat material. So this is a really good example of doing sculpture detail work inside of Substance Painter as opposed to inside of Zbrush, as this was just a simple alpha with height channel information, and you get that great detail there on that belt buckle. So with the boots, the ID maps that we set up are going to come in handy here, because basically all the texturing that we're going to be doing is driven by those ID masks. As you can see, I want to add a mask with color selection, and then add the color picker, and then pick the section that I want. This way you can keep all your textures in that one stack, but have all of them driven by their separate masks using those ID masks. So you can color pick there and just pick the sections that you want to have the material on, and that way you can have all of your multiple textures under one texture set while only using one mesh. So just adding some more detail here instead of ZBrush, actually just adding the stitching detail in Substance Painter, it's a lot more cost effective to be doing it in here. And also similar to the decision making that I made with the boots earlier, it's going to be a piece that's not really going to be seen that much in game. Like it would be either not in camera or realistically covered by something like debris or something that you would have on the bottom of a boot of a character of this kind. So as you can see here, I'm building up and layering over the top, which is another benefit of having all of this as one mesh, is just dropping a dirt or a grime material over the top of the whole thing, and it jumps over all the different sets and takes into consideration all of the height and specular information of all of the materials underneath it. So if the dirt is on top of something with bump, it will already add on top of that bump as well, so you get all that detail for free from your other materials. So kind of like what we spoke about earlier with the belt up the top, is heaps of different leathers and metals and fabrics, really just trying to make that differentiation apparent with all the different leathers here. So as you can see, the pants in the reference that I had, that I photo bashed, there was a really distinct pattern, ornamental pattern on the pants. So what I've done is I've actually gone and altered one that I found on Pinterest, and then brought it in as a channel over the top and mirrored it over the two different sections. And then similar to the way that I did the texturing for the hood and the scarf, just masking out the areas, so just grabbing parts of it that I want and layering it up in different areas. You do have a lot more control over it this way as well, so you can adjust that secondary pattern color because it's driven by a different material inside a Substance Painter, and also just layering up that dirt and grime that has been sort of the theme on the lower half of this character. So as you can see, ID picking that skirt dress padding area that I've got there. This was another material. I've actually got most of these materials from the Substance 3D Assets store. They've got some really great stuff on there, and everything is so insanely customizable. You can basically make it nothing like what it is that you bought it from. So I did a bit of study on materials of characters from this region, and I found that there was a lot of breakup. So there was a lot of different thickness and patterns and materials. So I think that was kind of the biggest thing, which is something that I wanted to do with this character as well, is just have a real array of different materials and fabrics, and the way that they all work together. If I could make it look like it wasn't just a mess of different things, I think it would have been somewhat of a success. So kind of just keeping that theme as well, going with the trim around the edge of the fabric. I thought that worked really well up with the hood, so I kind of wanted to bring it around and continue it down onto this skirt piece. So more of the the skills that we used earlier in this, the placement of an alpha using that 2D projection over on the right, and then adjusting it on to our 3D model using our UV space. Great for things like this, like one-off sections, like the hand with doing some tattoo work there, and also with the buttons up on underneath the armor. And so just moving over to the other side of the hand, I wanted to do a tattoo as well, but I just wanted to do it a little bit different, just to break up that symmetry on the model. So just continuing as well some of that stitching. A lot of the other pieces that we've got done stitching on, you could obviously do it in the high poly model. A lot of the high-end AAA games like God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn, they do a lot of their stitch and fine work detail like this actually in their high poly models. You can check those models out on ArtStation, but a lot of this detail, if it is extremely minor and far away like this little bit here is, I could get away with it here, but there's obviously so much more detailing we could be doing on all of this model. But yeah, you definitely need to pick your battles as far as what you are using as a actual model in the high poly, and texture detail inside a Substance Painter, because Substance Painter is getting so great with all of this edge work that you can see here that you can just throw it in there for free basically on a texture. Yeah, you really just need to weigh up what the options are as far as doing it in the high poly or doing it in the texture. So this is just, again, just projecting basically stencil detail on using alphas and height and specular information, and then continuing to use those gradient maps just to damage up and break up the bottom edges of that skirting area there. So moving on to the sword, this was another really short section of a Substance Painter job. It was only one UV texture set and only had 3 different materials, I think, on it. So it was another good excuse to kind of break up the project, to have it as somewhat of a hiatus from the main job. Yeah, so bringing in the high poly, so I actually built a little low res mesh for this as well. Brought it in, baked the maps, and then just threw on some pretty standard materials. I didn't think that this was, considering I was never going to actually do this this piece as part of the main project. I wasn't too precious with how much work I was going to be putting into it, but just some nice details in there, some nice materials as well. And as most of this was going to be covered by her hand holding it, I thought the end result was pretty good, considering it was just a nice quick little job. So moving on to one of the more daunting parts of this whole project was doing the Xgen. So doing Xgen hair isn't the most difficult thing that I've done in the past after some of the other projects I've done, but doing hair with a hood on it and then moving into Unreal Engine is something that I had done for the first time. So as you can see here, just creating a description for that first thing of hair. The way that I like to have tackled this, which I thought from the very start I would have tried to do it this way, and if it works then that'd be great, and it did end up working, was that I wanted to break it up into multiple sections. So in the reference and in my head of what I pictured this character was going to look like was that there'd be a hood and there'd be 2 sort of like bangs that come through the front, and the fringe, the front bangs area kind of goes pulled back into the hood. So really the only parts of the hair you would see would be the 2 side parts that come down outside of the hood. So if I was to do that all under one description, they would be talking to each other. So I really needed to have that firm breakup between, okay, this is the left side, this is the top, and this is the right side. And it actually worked for the most part pretty well. I also had the hood in there to double check to see if it was fitting well, and then if what hairs were protruding through there. But you can actually see here, I'm trying to do a piece from the center and it's just automatically pulling right to where that existing description was. So as you can see there, I've created the second description and then got those new hairs going back through the middle, which is exactly how I wanted it to look. It also gives you a little bit more control over each section as well, so you can be a little bit more aggressive with the moves. Like as you can see there, overlaying it over the top and then just hitting that refresh to see how it looks. And also different modifiers, so the top and the side and the width and the thickness of the hair. I did like to change it a little bit between the tops and the sides. So yeah, just having that extra control, putting them into the different descriptions does help quite a bit. So moving on to the other side of the head, I actually did that third description over there, even though I probably could have mirrored the other ones as a starting point. Xgen isn't really that friendly with that, and I just thought breaking up the symmetry was way easier doing it by hand. So this is one of my favorite parts of the whole project. Something that people ask me about all the time is the term that people talk about, ripping the Metahuman assets, and how you would do that. So what you can see here is I've actually made a Metahuman and then gone into the face asset of the Metahuman and then exported that asset. When you import that into Maya, it comes along with a whole bunch of other junk that's not this, and all you want to do is just delete absolutely everything other than the meshes that you want to be using for your game ready mesh. So in this case, I'm using the eye asset as well as the eyelashes. So there is a bit of back and forthing here when it comes to positioning them and getting them fitting to your model. But at the end of the day, this material, all you need to do when that model's done is drag the Metahuman materials onto your model, and then you get all their great materials like their hair and their eyes for free, basically. So jumping back into ZBrush to pose, as you can see there, I'm actually using the new Proxy Pose in ZBrush, which basically just creates a super low res proxy of your mesh, and then you can mask it and maneuver it the same way that you would with Transpose Master, but it is a little bit lighter, considering it does basically make a cage, like a low poly cage that fits around your mesh. And I just thought it was a good excuse to use it, you know, new piece of the software. Thought I'd give it a crack, and it's pretty much the same as Transpose Master depending on how low your mesh is. But if you do have quite a dense mesh, this is a great new tool for using like a super low res mesh, and then the result, as you can see there, is pretty good. So before jumping into Unreal, I thought I'd shout out the Cave Academy. So I used this scene as my presentation scene, as like the base. It's only £10, which I'm not sure what that is in dollars. It was about 20 bucks Australian for me. So it should be around that $20 mark. So after you import your low res mesh, posed mesh into Unreal, we're going to go into looking at the main material, master material that I put together for this scene. So basically all it is the 4 main textures that you're going to be using, which is your diffuse, your roughness, your specular, and your normal map. You can copy my node graph there for the normal map. Basically what this does is it helps you adjust the normal map's intensity. So it just needs a bunch of those little multipliers and appends. And then what we're doing here, we're going to do this for every single texture. So we're going to add a multiplier. We're going to put that into where it's supposed to go. You can see that's how it is out of the box. We're going to hit 1 and then click, and it's going to give you this one constant, convert it to a parameter, and then call it what it is. So this will be the roughness amount. So all of these we're going to be converting to parameters, specular intensity, convert to parameter, diffuse. So basically what we're doing here when we're converting all these parameters is we're basically creating an interface for our material instance, as you'll see in a minute. So we're going to go through and convert all these to parameters so that they're editable, and then we're going to create a material instance, and I'll show you how great that is. Just rename this last one normal map. Beauty. So we'll save that, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create a material instance off that master, and we can call it, let's start with the armor. So if we go into the armor material now, we can see that all of those channels that we've converted to parameters are now editable fields inside of our material instance. So this is a really basic master material instance graph as far as what we've enabled here. We've basically got our amounts of each thing and then our maps, which is kind of all we really need. So what we want to be doing here is duplicating each of our instances and calling them different things. So we're going to want one for our pants, we're going to want one for our boots, we're going to want one for our armor, and all the different things that we basically made maps for in Substance Painter. So that when we bring all our textures in, all we need to do is open up our little material instance for, say, our pants or our boots, and just drag our textures onto our nodes that we created there, as you can see here. It's easy as that. We can edit everything that we want on the fly, and when we have this material applied in the scene, we can actually see the changes in the scene on the fly as well. So that here we go, we've already made our hood instance. We're just going to drag them in over the top. Perfect. So this is great for any of the materials that we brought out of Substance Painter, anything that basically has a diffuse, metallic, normal roughness map. But then if we have a material that needs something a little bit more extensive with the subsurface scattering, like the Metahuman skin, you can actually drill down into that Metahumans folder there and get their skin material and then replace it with your textures. Exactly the same way that we were just replacing the textures just then. So we're going to open our skeletal mesh and then drag in our materials onto our character. So the reason that you want to be doing it like this and not dragging them into the scene is that we are updating our U asset this way. So this character now can be dragged and dropped into different levels and different maps straight from our content browser, because if you're just doing it into the scene, that's all it is. It's only active in that scene. So this is the correct way to do it, is to open up your skeletal mesh and then drag your materials into the corresponding spots inside here, which we've set up in Maya. I also kind of use this situation as another sanity check to kind of see, yep, all my materials are lining up. They all look like they're in the right place. There doesn't really seem to be any issues. As you can see here, those are the face and the eye materials that we grabbed from the Metahumans. All we're doing is dragging those straight onto those meshes. Eyes main, you've got your eyelashes there, the fluid, the cartilage, the ambient occlusion, all those were already named from the Metahuman, so you can see exactly which materials need to go onto them. So this is the part where we export our hair. So what you want to be doing is you want to convert your Groom to an interactive Groom, and then what it does is it actually generates these 3 new sections here, which then we want to export that as an Alembic file. So you go up to cache, over to Alembic cache, and then we want to go over into export. And then that's all you need to do, export. And then importing it is, if you don't have these on, make sure you go up into plugins and then go into Alembic Groomer and Alembic Importer. Make sure all 3 of those is ticked. And then you can just drag it in like you would any other mesh. And then it imports it as an ABC file, which is just another asset that you can then drag into Unreal. But the best way to do it, especially if you've got a hair with a character, is to go over into your mesh and then add a Groom. So when you're adding a Groom in here, you can drag it in, and then if you've got it positioned in the right place, which I didn't, so I needed to have a little bit of tweaking, it will snap exactly into the area that it needs to be in. So another question that I get asked a lot about is about binding. So you can see on your Groom there, you can right click bind and then create a binding, and then you would select the scalp mesh that your Groom was made on, which would be in your model if it was there. In my case, it's not, but if it is in there, then you create that binding, and then you are able to enable simulation. So what this will do is we'll create physics for your hair. So when your character moves, it will move it around. But in my case, we're just doing static hair for this mesh and moving our character around. Now the hair stays in place, it just doesn't have physics because our scalp mesh, I didn't have the scalp mesh in here, so the binding wouldn't have known what to bind itself to. So if we were to bind this Groom, I'll just do a quick little demo here. You obviously add that in like we did before, you drag your hair asset into there, and then your binding goes underneath it into that binding asset. Another tip when it comes to adding props into a character is to add a static mesh there while you have the mesh selected in your content browser. So we'll do it again here. It's now stuck in there, and we'll click on the other character, add static mesh while we have it selected. Boom, goes straight in exactly the way that the hair would have if it was in the right spot. But if we hit our material here, material instance from before, now we're changing one single material, add our textures in, editing, drop them all in, sweet, we'll hit save. And then now if we add this one material into our mesh inside here and click save, it will then update in all different areas of where we wanted those to be. So this is another beautiful thing with using material instances, is that you can creatively iterate on the fly like this and then see it adjust in your scene in multiple different areas all at once. So creating the cinematic scene, I actually wanted to shout these guys out. The Bazaar Scene, you can get it here from the Unreal Marketplace. What you want to do is download that asset and then click on your scene that you're using and then just add it to the project, so that when you are in your scene, it will then show up in your content browser there. It literally adds all the assets to your scene, as you can see in that little folder over the left there, Bazaar Meshingen. And then you just have all of the meshes that are in that scene. So I sort of kit bashed a little cinematic scene for this one, just using the meshes that come with it. As you can see, it's very well organized, very well laid out. This is another benefit from doing your character renderings in Unreal Engine in real time, is that you basically can just see what works and what doesn't. I tried multiple different meshes from this kit and kind of just kit bashed a bit of a scene together to try to see what worked. And there were things that didn't, but it didn't take me too long. Like I can try lighting, I can try different creative pieces on the walls, I can drop in, and there's so much free, like this was a free pack from the July set of free downloadables on the Unreal Marketplace. So I also highly recommend that you add, so you can already see there I'm iterating a different door. The other door was a little bit too weird. This one looks a lot better. Put this little shelf over there. Yeah, I recommend signing up to the Unreal Marketplace newsletter, as they let you know when there's new free scenes and assets to be downloaded, which is great. So a little bit of behind the scenes here of the build of the cinematic scene. It's just, you know, a few lights and you can see them working in real time, which is great. And also to be adjusting like the tone mapping of how I want it to be looking. You can adjust all the lens flares and stuff like that inside of the post-process volume, which is where you can basically art direct the image. Everything is all from that post-process volume. And now what we want to do is set up our renders. So the way that you do that in Unreal is you go up to that little clapper up there, add a level sequence. I already had one. So I'm going to go into my level sequence. I'm going to delete everything just so I can start from scratch. Set those frames to 1 because we just want to be rendering out 1 frame. We don't want to be running out 30 frames a second. We want to drag the camera in to the track there that we want to be using. In this case, it was 07 body. And then open this clapper there. This is our render settings. So this is pretty, you could do it straight off the get-go, but there's a few things that we want to change. I usually like to use EXRs and then anti-aliasing. So crank this up to 32. You're going to get a bit of a warning, but don't worry because we're going to override it. And then any of the other, render elements you've got there if you wanted them. If you wanted to change it up to 4K, you can change it to 4K. You can make it to 8K if you want, or whatever your resolution is. Accept, and then hit render. And so these are the final renders, the higher resolution 8K renders out of Unreal that have had minimal post done to them. But you can see the 8K high resolution renders of these on my ArtStation.
So that's pretty much it for the tutorial. Thanks for everyone who voted in the poll on my YouTube, or if you're still watching, thank you. I'm looking forward to not doing as many big projects, be a little bit more present on YouTube, do a few more lives. If you have any questions about anything that's been in this tutorial, I'd be really happy to answer them. Just drop them in the comments or hit me up on ArtStation. And I look forward to making more videos and being a little bit more present on YouTube. So thanks to everyone. I think we're just ticked over 500 subscribers now, which is crazy considering the little amount of content that I've put on there, but it really means a lot. If you can share this with someone that you know at your uni or your school, or someone that you think that would be that would enjoy this type of content, that'd be great. Thanks a lot. I'll see you in the next one.